In a global economy teeming with guest workers and migrant laborers who travel halfway around the world to make ends meet, is brown the color of cheap labor? That's just one of the tough and insightful questions Kamal Al-Solaylee considers in his new book, Brown: What Being Brown in the World Today Means to Everyone. He's an associate professor at the School of Journalism at Ryerson University, and he joins us once more here in the studio. Welcome back.
Thank you again for having me.
Now, when you wrote this book, you traveled to 10 countries, 4 different continents. At any time, did you feel unsafe?
I think I wouldn't say unsafe. I mean, there were parts in the Philippines that I would have, I live in Toronto, which is a pretty safe. So there were parts in the Philippines that were rough around the edges, but I felt uncomfortable in places like Paris, being a brown-skinned Muslim man after the few months after Charlie Hebdo. I felt uncomfortable as well on the streets of Phoenix, Arizona, because there is a kind of encounter between white police officers and undocumented migrant workers, largely Mexican, and I could easily be sort of mistaken for one. So I carried my ID with me at all time in case I get stopped. So I wouldn't say I mean unsafe necessarily, but I certainly felt the tensions in the communities that I visited.
And you were just visiting, so imagine if you lived there.
Yeah.
You write in the book that brown people are everywhere, but remain invisible or nameless. How so?
How so? Because, I would sort of encourage you to sort of walk around the streets of Toronto and look at the people who are serving in the food courts, in coffee shops. If you stay late in the office, who comes and cleans the office late at night, who's taking care of the children, the nannies who are taking care of the elderly, and tell me if these people have any kind of, I wouldn't say name recognition, if there's anyone speaking on their behalf. They fade into the background. Their role, again, is to serve others. And it's never about them. It's never about their needs, but it's about them fulfilling the needs of others. So in that sense, I do argue that the kind of global economy at large relies on labor by migrant workers, particularly brown migrant workers, but they're not part of the conversation about the economy and who benefits from that economy.
What's our role in society then? Are we in cahoots about how people are being treated? Are we okay with it?
So I sort of argue in the book that we sort of have accepted that and may have even gained from that, all of us, because some big corporations, whether it's a big corporation or it's just a young family who's looking for someone to look after their kids while both parents go to work. So what the solution is in view, given that there's lack of like daycare facilities, let's get a Filipino person or Indonesian person and pay her significantly less than what a Canadian person would accept to work in that job. So we are in a way, we're all colluding. And the point is that we have to ask, are we okay with an economy that really relies on the underpaid labor of millions of people? That, by the same token, they're the ones who keep our businesses open, they keep our coffee shops open, they keep our children looked after, our elderly taken care of. Now, this is a conversation that I hope the book will start.
It got me thinking a lot. So is there a difference if you're a light-skinned, unskilled person?
I think if you're unskilled, you could probably make up for it by the fact that you're light-skinned. But if you're unskilled and dark-skinned, then you're probably going to get the very bottom of the jobs, even within sort of the low-paid, labor-intensive, because I'm trying to avoid the word menial, because all work is meaningful and all work is important.
What if you're dark-skinned and middle class?
If you're dark-skinned and middle class, your experience will depend largely on the context. So within the people who know you and the circles you work in, yes, you may do well, but just walking down the street when no one knows you, you're just a very dark-skinned person. You're probably thought of as an immigrant who doesn't speak English, for example, in a Canadian context.
Well, in the book, you read about a young man who went to fashion school, and when he got there for an internship at Louis Vuitton, I think,
Right.
they
yes.
assumed he was a cleaning person.
He was the cleaning person, and they just pointed to the closet where the cleaning, where the bucket and the cleaning detergents are, because they just looked at him and almost like, what are you doing here in this sort of high fashion outlet? And because there's a certain association between skin color and the kind of labor and the kind of work they do. He was never seen as a fashion designer or a potential fashion designer, but the person who has come to clean the office.
What do you think that does to someone's psyche, where people always have such low expectations from you?
That's a very good question. I think it's demoralizing, because when you actually succeed in something, there may also be the fear that you only succeeded because of positive discrimination, or because someone took pity on you, or someone decided to give you a legs up, instead of you actually have worked to be where you are. So, for example, I remember when I got a job as a professor at Ryerson, one of my colleagues looked at me and said, "Oh, they love you. You have a PhD and you're a visible minority." And I felt really hurt by that, because, I also worked very hard to get, and I applied to that job, and I prepared really hard, and I'd like to think I got it fair and square. But for the rest of my life, I probably wonder, was I hired? Was I a diversity hire?
Because the seed has been planted.
Yes.
We were talking about Filipinos before, and Filipino nannies. Why did you choose to categorize Filipinos as brown?
Again, sort of largely because that's where they were placed originally in the brown race in the 19th century racialist science. And because within the Philippines, there are two categories of like the Malay, the brown, or the Chinese Filipino. And most of the domestic workers in Hong Kong tend to come from the Malay race, because the Chinese community in the Philippines is seen as the market dominant community. But that's not to say that whether you're of a Chinese background, Chinese Filipino or Malay, once you are in that domestic work realm, you're seen as non-Chinese anymore. So in the context of Hong Kong, you're seen as brown. You're seen as this other Filipino person, coming from an Asian country that is not as economically advanced as Hong Kong.
That's really interesting. Why is that?
I think, again, it's what we do. Like it gets sort of, it gets reflected back on our skin color. So I talk in the book. I moved to this about 6 years ago. I moved to a building largely sort of in Midtown Toronto, largely white and elderly residents. And I had a dog at the time, and I was taking him out for a walk, and somebody automatically assumed I was the dog walker, not actually a resident, and asked for a business card. and I think, it was summer, so I was kind of dressed, in shorts and
You're being kind.
I'm trying to, I love my neighbors. But I think the assumption was that I didn't belong in that building. So if I had a dog, then I must be a dog walker and doing, a job for like $15 an hour, because that's my place in the world.
Well, you write that the Philippines takes pride in its people power. What does that mean?
They train people to work abroad and to serve others, and they have placed some safeguards around the safety and their well-being while they're abroad. But they also rely on the money they send back to their families, the remittances that they send back, and it's become a very sort of regulated industry. It is. There is certain. When I went to this school that prepares people to work on cruise ships and clean hotels, and there's a certain kind of pride that they take in serving others. Now that not everyone agreed that that's a good thing, but they are trained to they're trained how to serve others with a smile constantly. That I find kind of on one part charming, and on another part kind of creepy as well.
Right, because is there a demand for Filipino workers around the world?
Absolutely. I mean,
And is that part of the reason? Because they've been trained to be service, to
well,
work in the
they're
service
trained to
industry?
serve other. So in the kitchens, because I also visited the kitchen of that school, they're not trained to prepare Filipino food at all, because it's assumed that they will work abroad or aboard cruise ships, in which case it's largely either Japanese or German. So they also have to train a little bit of Japanese and a little bit of German language. And the thinking is that they will act as the people who give other people good times, that they will make their trip better, they will make their beds, they will create these towels in the shape of animals, which is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. And they will then, but they will kind of slide into the background after that.
I mean, it's when I'm trying to collect my thoughts on this question, because it seems like the government is training Filipinos to leave the country to work abroad. But when people leave the country, they're leaving their families. Doesn't that come into play? Like how?
It does, because and there's I mean there are a lot of studies about the impact of the migrant workers, both on the families they leave behind and on the workers themselves. So in the case of domestic workers, the female domestic workers, and 83% of people who work in the domestic sort of service are female. There are some positive impacts as well. So yes, they do leave their children behind. And I interview many women in the book who have not seen their children for 2, 3, or 4 years, and they spend all their time raising other people's children. But it also allows them to send money back to their families, allowing their kids to go to better schools, maybe have better food on the table, live in safer neighborhoods. So there is an impact on that these women particularly, the money that they send back actually spreads throughout the community and sort of goes much further.
And you say that these women are heroes.
I do think so. I do think so. They're resilient. They are hardworking. I mean, their working day is 12, 16 hours on average. Take one day off a week, and yet they are charming. They're willing to talk to me. I mean, in many cases, I find that I find it hard to actually get hold of, for example, Filipino officials, whereas I find it so easy to talk to the workers, because they were far more just generous and kind and willing to tell their stories.
You also visited Hong Kong. How would you characterize the treatment of domestic workers in that country?
What actually happens in the domestic realm is that it's a private realm. So it's not like you can get a labor inspector to come into your home and see where your domestic mate is living. So once that arrangement, even though it's work, it's labor, it unfolds in a domestic space. So it's hard to kind of enforce notions of fairness and the number of hours you're supposed to work. And the situation has improved, but there are many, many cases of abuse and violence, both verbal and physical.
Can you tell us some stories of how some of these workers have been treated?
Certainly. I mean, so they face pressure I'm assuming you're talking about Hong Kong women, Filipino women in Hong Kong. They face pressure from Chinese families because they're working in a very intimate space. They're in the home. So one of the things that they would tell me is, for example, that the lady of the household might feel jealous because this Filipino woman is spending more time with her children than she is, and they maybe kind of fear that the husband and the kids now see her more in the mother figure role. So they tend to be a kind of not just instead of appreciation for the work that they do, there's also, it comes with the resentment about them usurping the role that usually would have been played by the mother in the house. But the living conditions sometimes you don't really get I mean, most of the domestic workers, in fact, all of the domestic workers in Hong Kong have to have live-in arrangements. They have to live in with the family that hired them. And, but that doesn't mean you get your own room, or what you get is maybe, if you're lucky, a little alcove, or you sleep on a mattress in the kitchen, or somewhere in a corridor or a hallway, no privacy. And you are at the beck and call of your employers 24 hours a day. So if you have an older person who's senile or who's going through dementia, gets up in the middle of the night, you still, part of your job is to, there's no separation between, this is now my break, I'm off for the evening. It just continues 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. And all of that, in addition to the fact that there are some racist overtones in the way that because they're darker skinned, brown basically, that they're not worthy of the same humane treatment.
That they're things.
That they're owned. They're largely property. Yes.
And there's like domestic workers from Sri Lanka as well.
Right.
Are they treated differently from Filipinos, or?
Yes, in part because the training of Sri Lankan domestic workers is not as well developed as that in the Philippines. So I mean, only recently has the Sri Lanka taken initiatives to train their workers and to train them also in the sense of empowering them to say no and to say, I'm not going to do that extra work unless you pay me. And then it sort of goes also to a much more serious thing, either beating or rape or sometimes also murder.
You also wrote about visiting Qatar, and you cite a pretty startling statistic. On average, one migrant worker a day dies building its office towers, stadiums, and other parts of the country's infrastructure.
Right.
How do you reconcile such horrible treatment happening towards fellow brown people in a brown country?
Well, I mean, it was vital for me to visit a place like Qatar because I really wanted to show that sort of anti-brown racism, anti-brown sentiments is not just something that happens in a white or a Chinese context, but it can happen within the brown community. So Qatari people may well be darker skinned than some of the workers that they hire, but they have the benefit and the huge privilege of money and status. Like I never spoke to a single Qatari person while I was there because just that they're sort of isolated from.
Really? You didn't speak to one person?
Not one.
So all the workers are in one separate?
One separate section, one separate part of town, basically. They're literally in a ghetto where the workers live, the industrial area. And what happens there is that you have a population like, whether it's Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Dubai, that is so extremely wealthy that it shields them from the experience of the of the construction workers, which they import by the millions, because obviously there aren't enough Qatari men to do the construction work. So you have to bring in labor. In fact, 100% of that labor is in the construction industry is imported.
I was going to ask because maybe Qatari men think that's beneath them to do.
Well,
maybe.
Certainly. I mean, they could not possibly live on the wages that these workers receive. And what happens here is just the kind of the hubris of an economy that has done so well, and now all the jobs that they don't want to do, they can do, it just gets farmed out. It just gets farmed out to people who are either dark-skinned or darker-skinned.
And they're so far removed from their daily existence.
They're completely out of sight. I mean, they basically sort of bust in and out of between the construction site and the home. They're allowed to kind of go into, they're allowed to roam freely, obviously, in the industrial area, but you don't see many of them just walking down the downtown parts of Doha, unless they're also working there.
And what are people giving up when they migrate to Qatar?
Well, they're certainly giving up the family connections that they have. I spoke again to many men, because in Hong Kong I talked to women. In Qatar I talked to men who have not seen their spouses or their children for many years. They're growing away. The children growing up away from them, and I will say, however, that when the contracts are all sort of legal and they get the money they were promised, these men are then able to save much more than they would have been able to in their home country, in Sri Lanka in this case, because this simply, in some cases, you get paid 4 times as much as you would have paid in Sri Lanka. Now, again, that's a salary that you and I would not accept. Like, I would not go and work in Doha for $400 a month. But to some of these workers, $400 a month is a windfall.
When you see people, migrants on boats, I always think, well, whatever they're leaving must be worse than what they're going, being in a boat in the middle of nowhere.
Right. If you're facing death on your journey across the sea, or death at home, and you choose, okay, I'd rather die in sea than die in a war zone, that tells you what a hard decision that is. And especially, if I were by myself, that would be one thing, but to take your children and to put your children through that risk, and largely the people who are, whether it's Syrian, Iraqi, Libyan, this is the waves of migration from North Africa and the Middle East towards Europe at the moment that we're seeing as we speak, is a largely brown wave of migrants.
And you spent some time in the UK, and you also write about some of those experiences. And in the book, you go back, and you said something that I thought was really interesting. You talked about the PREVENT program. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, okay, it's part of this sort of part of the culture of the post 9/11 world in general, and in the UK particularly the July 7 bombings in London 2005, and it is it's a kind of a preemptive strike in a way against terrorism. It has different components, but one of them is preventing people from becoming radicalized. And by that I mean young Muslim men and women from becoming radicalized. And what it is a kind of, it implies that there is a kind of the conveyor belt thesis that if you start by just saying, like, I feel uncomfortable about the treatment of Muslims in Afghanistan, and then that might become the first indication that you're being radicalized. So the PREVENT program actually asks, like, school teachers, doctors, social workers to keep an eye on any hints of radicalization. So in one case, I attended this day conference where people were sharing stories, and so when some young Muslim child when some child, I should say, because I'm not 100% sure it was Muslim, talked about sort of biological degradation and what we're doing to nature, was reported to the PREVENT program as, okay, this child is starting to think about radical ideas, and
he's being critical.
He's being critical, and the thinking is that what you think may lead into actions that the British government would try to stop you from doing. But that's such an that's an interference in your freedom of speech and also in your freedom of thought. You're allowed to think that there is oppression in the Muslim world, but that doesn't mean that you'll take up jihad. But the problem with PREVENT is that it assumes that one would lead to the other.
I want to bring this back home to North America. And when it comes to debates on immigration and security in both the U.S. and Canada, Latinos and Muslims are caught in the middle. How involved would you say they are in shaping the discourse on these issues, like brown people?
I would say that we fall under completely different parts of that same like the border conversation. So, for example, Latino of Mexican workers find themselves sort of under the undocumented. They're entering the country illegally, crossing sort of border states between Mexico and the U.S. And their presence becomes a problem because they're not supposed to be there. But the thing about Muslim communities and brown communities of Muslim faith in particular is that they, in many cases, they have been there for generations, and they are there, and they're there because they're there to study or to work or to conduct business, and they're entering the country illegally, and yet their presence is seen as suspicious. How much as a community, we're not always very vocal about expressing protest or about the way we get treated, and I don't know if that's something that will change, but I certainly hope that those two communities will work together, because the issues may be different, but this being treated with suspicion is the same.
Now, after writing this book, what insights have you drawn about your own experience as a brown person living in Canada?
I certainly became really aware, not so much of my skin color, but of my race privilege, of my class privilege. That was a Freudian slip. Of my class, I became aware of my class privilege, that being a university professor, being a journalist, in many ways protects me from a number of experiences that newer immigrants are going through, and that in some cases, despite the fact that when I'm walking down the street, I'm perceived as a brown person, but there are ways I conduct myself, the way I dress, the way I talk, the way I just generally behave, that is designed to kind of protect me from being seen as suspicious. So whenever I travel, I actually dress up because I want to be taken seriously, and I notice that I'm less likely to be stopped for random security check or secondary check, as they say.
Kamal, I wish I had you as a professor when I was at Ryerson.
I wish I had been a student. You will be a very tough student.
Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.